Going into game 9 of the World Chess Championship, the challenger Sergei Karjakin was leading. Just 4 games to go, and Magnus Carlsen needed to win at least one of those games, those last 4 games, to force a playoff. So it was going to be interesting to see how Carlsen was going to manage this game 9, where he was playing with the black pieces. Would he go all out for a win? Would he try for a draw and then press with the white pieces in his later games? Well, this was a pretty long game, and I'm going to cut to the absolute high point of the struggle after move 38, king g2. Karjakin with the white pieces, and this was a very sharp variation of the Spanish that Carlsen employed. It was a pawn sacrifice, a very well-known pawn sacrifice, very heavily analysed at the top levels of chess, and indeed Karjakin has a lot of experience. He's played this line with white on several occasions, so Carlsen really had to be absolutely sure that he knew what he was doing theoretically. Well, let's just take a look at the position and sketch it out. You can see that white is a pawn up, extra d pawn here, but white's pawns on the king side are a little bit split, and of course that can mean that the king is a little bit weakened. But Karjakin, I think, well, earlier on in the middle game, coordinated his pieces very well indeed. He played much more evenly than Carlsen, and this seems to be a pattern in the match actually. While now and again Carlsen comes up with some rather brilliant moves, actually Karjakin is far steadier. And in this position, this is looking pretty bad for black. Carlsen in deep trouble. Compare white's very harmoniously placed pieces. They're working very well together. The 2 bishops in particular. This bishop here doesn't have an opponent. Looking very nice, putting pressure on the knight on d5 and maybe later indirectly on f7. The rook looks a bit weird on h4, but sometimes there are attacking chances on the king side. Sometimes it can bounce back through the middle. Compare this with black's forces. So the pieces in the middle, okay, these aren't bad. Well, we need a pawn on e6 to stabilise that knight. But this rook on a1, stranded, not connecting with the rest of black's pieces, and it's unprotected as well. So tactically, this feels as though it's gone badly wrong for Carlsen. Now, he had 3 moves to make to get to the time control at move 40. And not an easy decision for him at all. Well, one option would be to push this rook here, comes back into the middle, and then maybe push this rook again. So pressure off the knight on d5, then the rook comes back. But I can understand why Carlsen rejected this, because it's very hard for black to do anything here, and white can just kind of poke and probe with these bishops. This is a very uncomfortable position indeed for black. So I'm not surprised that Carlsen somehow wanted to force the issue, and he thought for 6 minutes. Didn't have huge amounts of time left, but he played knight e7. Now, this knight move really surprised me. What's his idea? Well, he wants to put this knight on f5. Now, if the knight reaches f5, then all is well and good for black. That knight in a beautiful position, supported by the g-pawn. Well, obviously attacking the rook for the moment, but looking at d4. I mean, there might even be possibilities later to gain some kind of attack on the king. You know, if the rook moves away, then knight h4 could be possible. The knight on a beautiful square on f5. So what's not to like? Well, putting knight on f5, great idea. The problem is the transition. It takes 2 moves to get there, and while while, excuse me, my arrows have gone awry. It takes 2 moves to get there. And white has a whole move to have a go at that weak point, this neuralgic point on f7. This is very sensitive, and there are 2 ways that Karjakin can do this. He can sacrifice on f7. This is already very tempting, considering that it might bring the rook into the game. Or he can play queen to b3 to put more pressure here. Now, Karjakin was ahead on time. His play was very impressive in this game. As I said, he played far more evenly, and he played far quicker than Carlsen, who really doesn't look like he's in the best form. And both these moves are very tempting. So what's with queen b3? Let's have a look at this. And there are some nice tactics here. So the knight comes to f5, but now white seizes the chance to take on f7. Now there are various lines here, but let me show you the main continuation. At first I thought this was completely winning for white. Now if the knight comes back to block, then bishop h6 wins back the piece. So the king comes forward, and then rook takes c7. Now at first I thought, well, this looks fantastic for white. But instead of taking here, which probably is very good for white, in fact, black has drawing chances here with this move, knight h4, dragging the king up the board. Now, if the king, for example, goes to the side, then rook g8 is a tricky move, and suddenly there are chances to, the king is obviously, trapped at the side. It's not pleasant. Let's go back. So king h3, not good. King f4. Now in this position, then you can take it. Basically, black is taking this pawn while the king is in on a very poor square tactically. And amazingly, this is very, very difficult for white to make progress. He has 2 extra pawns, 3 against 1. But actually it's not so clear. Of course, these pawns are a little bit vulnerable. This is the white's problem. And this is not a clear win. And of course, Karjakin was considering this in great detail. Karjakin thought for 26 minutes over this next move, and he would have been considering queen b3 and bishop takes f7 to find out which gave him the best chances. 26 minutes he thought, and he was down to his final seconds before he lashed out with bishop takes pawn check. Of course, this has to be taken. Now, at first I thought this looks spectacular, and this could be winning for white. Giving up the rook, checking here. Well, in a blitz game, you might think this is winning, threatening mate, and that the knight can't move because of the pin, but black saves himself with queen takes pawn, covering this square. So rook takes h7 doesn't win, but Karjakin played queen c4 check. Now, Magnus has to step very carefully with his king. If the king comes up, then rook takes pawn, threatening mate. This is a disaster. Mate, of course, with either rook f7 or queen f7. If the queen steps in the way here, then rook h7, check, king up, and queen takes bishop. Well, 3 pawns up, winning attack. What else have we got? Well, queen d5, again, queen takes c7, must be winning. Knight d5, blocking the check, and now rook takes and a skewer. So in this position, black's king has only one move, king g7, only move. And now if check, the king comes up, and remarkably, the king is safe enough. So Karjakin played d5. Now this looks absolutely terrifying. After d5, this diagonal is open. Now, remember what I said about this loose rook. If this rook was somewhere sensible, on the back rank, this wouldn't be an issue. But suddenly bishop c3 check, among others, is threatened. Carlsen found the only move to continue. Luckily he'd passed the time control. He had enough time to think. This move looks very tempting to close the diagonal, but bishop c3 is still very strong. Obviously if that's exchanged, then that wins the rook, end of game. And if queen d6 to support the bishop, now there's a beautiful winning move, queen f4, pin and win. Queen can't be taken because it puts king in check. And bishop takes bishop, wins the queen. Lovely move, queen f4, these cross pins. So Carlsen had to play in this position knight to f5. It looks as though black is hanging on by a thread, but it's the only move and it works. And now the best that white has is to give a check. Again, this is an only move for black. If the king steps here into this discovered check, it's fatal. So the king has to come here. Only move. He's like Indiana Jones. Will he tread on the right stone, or will he, drop into a pit of snakes? That's what it feels like here. Well, Magnus stepped correctly, and these exchanges are forced, and now queen takes pawn. So we've arrived at a position where white is still a pawn up, but with all the pawns on the same side and white's pawns wrecked, then it's very difficult to make progress. Okay, at first it seems like white still has some attack here, but in fact you can't make progress in this position. There are lots of checks, but it's simply not good enough. The queen is able to defend here. You can put the queen back, or indeed king e7 is probably okay in that position as well, queen g8. So in this position Karjakin withdrew the queen to d4, but Carlsen set up a fortress here, and well, the game went on for another 30 moves with Karjakin poking away at Carlsen's position. Actually, I thought Carlsen defended very well. He made it look very easy, but there was a few tricky moments here. But in the end, nothing doing. This was nice. Carlsen allowed the queen back in, but actually the king just dances around back the other side of the queen and bishop, and in fact white makes no progress. So, well, I won't take you through the remaining 20 moves, but not a lot happened, although Karjakin tried. So after 74 moves, finally the players agreed to a draw. Karjakin gave in and gave Carlsen his draw. This was an absolutely fascinating struggle where Karjakin came so close to winning. I think Carlsen would have been so relieved at getting a draw out of this, because Karjakin played the better chess, no doubt about it. And on that 39th move, when Karjakin thought for 26 minutes, maybe he could have done better with queen b3. That probably would have given him at least more winning chances in that endgame of rook and bishop against rook and knight, but very hard to calculate. And even getting to that ending, Carlsen would have had some drawing chances. So impossible to say during a game which would have been better. Anyway, a draw, and that means there are now 3 games to go. Karjakin is still a game up, but that draw will have given Carlsen some confidence. He saved the day, and he still has 2 whites in those remaining 3 games. Let's see how they get on in game 10 that's played on Thursday, tonight, Thursday. See you then.